Some of the other things too. So that's sort of the character setting for plot. So if you're trying to build like a lightweight game or a lightweight scenario for your individual classes, this is sort of where I end up start or where I start. And then the other aspects are the tone. Is it sort of silly? You know, is it serious? Is it dangerous? Is it dark? You know, all sorts of different adjectives that you can throw on there. Because obviously, when you're working in this world of Splatoon, they're not destroying each other and spraying each other's guts all over the place, right? It's a childlike game, so you can sort of get into the mechanics of, you know, creating a paint gun that doesn't get you down sort of darker alleys. Point of view that there is also second, which is the you, which is sort of common, but first person, right? So are you going to be playing through the role through the perspective of an individual person, and is that individual person sort of the author of the story that you're telling as it's happening? You got third person distant, which is like a godlike perspective. Third person close, which is where you are not, the player is not acting as that character, but they're very, very close. So an example might be like the Grand Theft Auto series, where you'd be very close to that person, but you're not playing as, you know, and I think it's Grand Theft Auto 4, you're not playing, you're not Nico, you're playing as Nico. So you think about, well, what does the distance do for you in a narrative? And then the second is you, which is very common in all sorts of interactive fiction, choose your own adventure books. You're doing this, you're doing that, right? And then finally, theme is, are there any other overarching themes that you can work into it that the story will then sort of like at the end of it, oh, you made these decisions, and this means, you know, true love always conquers in the end, or, you know, big government will never lead us to freedom, or whatever it is, right? Like whatever sort of thematic thing. And a lot of times, when people who are new to telling stories or they're not familiar with narrative design, it's a lot of balls to be keeping in the air at one time. And this is a way to sort of proceed to kind of go through and check through and say, am I thinking about this? Have I considered this? And what are the options? What are the alternatives? Could I change this? Because there are a lot of times that I've gone, when we used to go to the Games Learning Science or Games Learning Society conference, there'd be many times in which someone would blame the narrative for not getting the students involved. And it's like, okay, but the narrative is complex, right? It may only be the setting that you need to tweak. It may be that your character is really boring, right? And the rest of it is the same. So those are some of the things that I work primarily with game design students and illustrators. So as much as I love writing fiction, they're not into it as much. So this is more of a media independent kind of way of looking at how you would tell a story. It's kind of, you know, it's fairly in the Western sort of Aristotelian tradition. If you know the sort of Aristotle and the Freytag pyramid of the story arc, if you don't know the Act One, something happens that it's sort of irreversible, that there are events that happen here. You get rising action throughout Act Two. And then at the very end of Act Two or at the very beginning of Act Three, you get a climax, and then you get a very short sort of resolution. That's like a very basic, 30-second look at sort of the Aristotelian plot structure. So it's for me, what I found is that a lot of people, when they're trying, if they've not thought about storytelling very much, they experience tons and tons of stories. They watched every episode of Grey's Anatomy. You know what I mean? We all have internalized stories in some sense, and Hollywood particularly is very big on this sort of approach. But it can be really helpful if you're trying to design a scenario to just make sure that you're using these things as checklists. And then also thinking about, okay, well, what would be the thing that you're lost and you can't get back home until you solve the riddle or whatever it is, right? There's something that means that you need to keep moving forward in the narrative, and just having a little know-how of some of these terms and some of the ways we have traditionally thought about narrative. If you start to get comfortable with this, and like, if you're reading writing professor, then there's lots of ways that you can iterate on all this stuff sort of all the time. It's like infinitely and reconfigurable to come up with lots of different stories. But with a little practice, it's like, oh, okay, well, this is where I would find a character that would have a problem where that would push them forward towards a climax, right? And this is where usually the theme points to the climax. Questions, comments, things that, is this useful, not useful? Things that people want to talk about that's related to this or not related to this.
In addition to that, one of the structures that was helpful for me when I was designing the Splatoon thing was just listing out as part of the setting, the people, places, things.
Yeah.
and just having set up and ready to go so that when I brought my students into this world, that I have backup people, backup places, and like additional things that I can pull from that may or may not make it into the narrative.
Yeah, and that's where, so some of the work that I've done on world building too, for those of you who play role-playing games, what role-playing games tend to give you, like Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast, they're the masters of this, is they give you tons and tons and tons of source books. They give you lots of material to draw from, and you're never going to use all, right? But you can pick and choose, and just the fact that you know that these things exist, give you some sense of what that world is like, right? So even if you don't use the stuff, just knowing that there are, changelings or whatever in the world creates sort of a sense of what this world is possible or is capable of. Anyone working on a game narrative that they've got questions about or want to pitch?
I actually wanted to, not to put you on the spot, but I was going to ask Devin to comment on development of Parent, which is his narrative-driven.
Yeah. I just downloaded it, by the way. Everybody.
That's awesome. So that's something that I started as my senior project under Steve's supervision, and sort of grew out of. Also, my mask's very thick, so I hope that it's coming across. My favorite types of games to play are role-playing games, and my favorite part of role-playing, of embodying that character and role-playing that experience, is interacting with other characters in the world, which often comes through dialogue. So a social simulation was always what I wanted to do as my senior project, and to develop into a game that I just put out on Steam. So for that one, I had a few specific goals, the most important one being how to make the player feel like they're talking to a person, and if not a person, then an interesting enough character. And what I sort of think I found out during that process, as a takeaway for myself on interactive storytelling, is that no matter like how sophisticated you might program a character or a dialogue system or a conversation, the action of having a meaningful conversation, like every other action in a game, takes place not in the code base, not even on the screen, but takes place in the player's head. So the personalization of that character that happens when you encourage the player to invest them with more agency, more motivation, more personality than you could ever program into them. So for me, it was all about like finding that right balance between meaningful feedback to the player, and also like choosing what information to conceal and share. Because if you don't share any information with the player, it can be frustrating if they're not looking for an experience that organic. And if you share too much, it becomes too overtly gamified for them.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't give them that space to invest that character with more personality than is explicitly in the text or in the system.
Did you write all the characters?
Yeah.
And how many were there?
There were 5 characters, 4 of them have most of the dialogue.
Yeah, because it's hard to do, right? I mean, this is where trying to create different characters. So this is also where doing cooperative narrative, like if you can get other people to help and just say, I'm going to take these 2 characters, you take these 2, and somebody else take 2 or 3 more. It's really hard. So my digital dissertation, when I got my PhD, was 8 people that were playing, 8 real people that were playing a role-playing game where they each control different characters. So I was trying to multiply the number of voices, and there's only so much I could do to not sound like myself. You know what I mean? Whereas if I had Wendy volunteer and write 2 of the characters, she's not going to write anything like me, right? So this is where, too, the collaborative aspect, the cooperative aspect of a narrative can help you build in. Because it's hard to try to be someone who's not yourself.
I like one of the things that you said that I was thinking about, the distinction between what happens on the design side and what happens on the player side. And I'll say, like, first of all, I kind of just like the definition that we put up there of emergent narrative, because technically in games isn't all narrative a result of play, but that's an obnoxiously pedantic English professor thing to get into. But I was thinking about when my husband and I played Dead Space 2, which, like you would say, has a very traditional linear story. There's not a lot of options. But I feel like we had this emergent narrative about, is it Simon? Is Simon Dead Space? I'm trying to remember now. Whatever. And his abusive relationship with his ex-girlfriend that just won't leave him alone. And so the way that we characterized the main character and his relationship with Nicole made the game very, very enjoyable to us. It was not necessarily what the designers perhaps intended, but we related to those characters in a particular way that I think is close enough to the source material that it's still fair. But it was like our emergent narrative in a very linear story. And it sounds like you're kind of talking about the same thing, like finding that line between what you define for players so that they read it in the way that you want them to read it, and that is sometimes important, and what you leave open enough for them to have that sort of participatory storytelling and where that falls, which I think, like, to me, that's personally what I'm very interested in.
Yeah, that reminds me too, like I read a paper on Fallout where they've got the karma system where you can either do good deeds or bad deeds. And very few players, unless they're deliberately trying to do it, come up with a neutral person because you start making decisions. And as you start making those decisions, nothing programmatically is being fixed. But in, like you say, in your mind, you're like, oh, my character is like a chaotic good guy. You know what I mean? Or whatever it is. And you start to play making those decisions because you've got this conception of who your character is. Whereas if you're doing things that are good and bad and then good and bad and good and bad, that's typically someone who's trying to go for a neutral.
I think that there are perks
Yeah.
related to either.
Right,
So
right.
like I only 45% agree with that.
Yeah.
Because like it is reinforced through the design mechanics that you don't get any benefits for being neutral. You only get benefits if you're at the extreme.
Yeah. Yeah, true. Yeah, it depends on whether you're playing the game or trying to tell a story too, right? Because that's more of a min-max kind of thing than I'm going to tell a story about kind of lone wanderer, my character. But it's open for either, right? It's open for either kind of play. Yeah.
So I just had a couple comments about like differentiating characters when you're doing world building. A couple of things that have been helpful for me. One is just come up with contrived scenarios and think of the different ways that your group of characters would react. You know, so like if they go to a restaurant, what do they order? You know, like if they're stuck with a kid that they don't know, are they excited about that? Are they anxious about that? You know, that sort of thing. And then the other thing I do, because I am trained as an historian, is to just constantly read and steal from history. So I recommend for everyone, even if you are not into history, and especially for getting, you know, in the habit of different voices, just reading from a real person, regardless of the era, to get into personalities and then transfer, you know, the parts of that. You don't have to mimic it, just the parts that you find most interesting into your own characters.
So can you tell me a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about what it is that you do? Because I was talking about this with lunch with Roger, is that both of us have run into historians that are so fixated on fact that they don't want to do anything that's historically accurate. Like if I took a historically accurate character from the Revolutionary era or whatever of U.S. history, the historians that I tend to work with wouldn't even be interested. They're like, find a real person, right? And tell us factually what that person did, which is very anti-game kind of thinking. So have you done those kinds of simulations?
Well, I mean, I made a like historically themed game called Blackhaven that has via the archives like a lot of different historical characters' voices that are speaking, so they're in period. But I think that it works well regardless of whether you're doing something in period or not. I mean, I think like the best pop example of this is like Game of Thrones. You know, like you can recognize lots and lots of different characters in Game of Thrones who remind you of like you know, early modern English history in particular, but there's also bits of other parts of that sprinkled in too. But I think, that just like that, to me, it's easy to see, you know, to transfer those personality traits to like a modern person, but just to get the, you know, as opposed to like reading really great characters in fiction or whatever, you get strangeness and authenticity from reading history in terms of people's complexity that you might not get just from reading other good literature because those characters were crafted to match up with all the other things that the book was trying to do. So
Yeah.
I just think that that's always a really powerful place to draw inspiration.
Yeah, George R. R. Martin's a really interesting example because he changes perspective every chapter and tells you the name of the chapter, it's Tyrion that's going to be talking about this chapter, and it stays in Tyrion's perspective the entire chapter, and then it goes to Jon Snow. So it's a very deliberate, it's good for writers to be able to study how do you change those perspectives. I think it got somebody off of it.
Yeah, you just made a comment that I kind of want to go back to. I think you said something along the lines of like being fact-driven is anti-game. Do you want to expand on that?
Well, I mean, take it back. Yeah, but, do you have a question, comment?
Well, I just had a comment on something else, but if you want to go about that first.
So what I was meaning is like it's more of a simulation rather than a reenactment, right? Where the historians that I've talked to want pure reenactment of who is a real person and what did they do. And I think there's a lot of value in being able to say, let's procedurally generate a character with some random stats. And you tell me, what do you think they would do, right? It seems to me that a student would have to have an equal amount of mastery over that social situation to be able to talk about a hypothetical rather than just say, historically, this is what this person did. Does that make sense?
Sure, but at the same time, some of my other work is on researching native characters in games, so that's the angle that I'm coming at this from. On the other hand, there are very real reasons why we might not want to just dump facts out there. Like, I totally agree with what you just said, right?
Yeah.
That a game should not just be a straight reenactment. But we should not just whole cloth dump facts either.
Towards that.
Because that takes us to really awful places.
Right, where they would rely more on stereotype than they would on an actual historical record. But no, it's the idea that to me, it's weird. And there are historians, obviously, who are not doing that. But it's like, wouldn't you, like, history could have turned out differently if people acted differently, right? You know what I mean? So it's important to know what they did do, but it's also, important to open up the possibility
Like,
that people should have.
which facts
Which
are
facts.
important and which facts can be played with. And I think I would argue that, like, setting is a fact that shouldn't be played with, maybe tone. But plot is probably one that could be played with, or character is one that could be played with, right? Yeah. So when you're doing something that's culture history based, is there wiggle in the structure and where isn't there wiggle?
I think it's an open, that's like an interesting question.
No, I have the answers to it.
Exactly.
I don't.
Yeah, did you?
So I was gonna say, like, in addition to steal from history part is, I literally just keep some of my favorite novels like right next to my desk, and if I get stuck or I can't figure out how to start like a sentence or a paragraph, steal from just fiction too.
Yeah.
Like, it's a good thing to just have that resource just for, like, if you get stuck for a second, just open to a random page, read like a paragraph, and that alone can be something.
It's really dependent on how good your taste in fiction is. Right? Like, you
Quite
go
possibly.
way wrong.
Yeah, people like to try to write. I assume most people that want to write for a living are going to try to write towards the things that they like. Hopefully they have good taste. Otherwise,
Right. I don't know. My students, I don't know. They don't read a whole lot, so I don't know if they've got the best taste in fiction. One of the other things too that someone was talking about. Anybody read Scott McCloud's Art of Comics, right?
Understanding comics.
Understanding comics, yeah. But he's got this whole thing on if the character has no features whatsoever, you're more likely to project yourself. Where if the character has lots of very specific features, then you're going to see them as someone else. And that's neither good nor bad, but it matters on what it is that you're trying to do, right? If you're trying to get somebody to be in that situation, one of the things that, I don't know if people have heard of ludonarrative dissonance, but that's where the game mechanics and the narrative are working against each other. And an example of that is like going back to Grand Theft Auto, is when you're playing, I think it's Grand Theft Auto 4, that's the one with Nico, right, in New York, in Vice City. But like he can have like an emotional whatever cutscene in which he does the sympathetic thing, and then go out, get in his car, drive down the sidewalk, and run over 10 people. Right? That's ludonarrative dissonance. See, why would he make that emotional choice and then go out and randomly kill 10 people? Whether it's a problem or not kind of depends on why you're playing the game, what you think what you're trying to get out of it. But in terms of like a coherent story, it's a little bit more. It's weird because you're able to make some of the decisions for that character, but ultimately that character is going to be who they are, right? So again, these are just things that from if you're continuing to make games, if you're asking students, if you're making scenarios in which your students are going to be in games, just thinking a little bit about some of these questions. Are you going to give them a character? Are you going to allow them to be their own character? What is the setting that would present problems the plot would generate from their decisions? Thinking about what might be that point in which they cannot come back. Like, there's a door beyond this door if you cannot return. Like those kinds of setups from a very basic narrative design perspective to really help get you off on the right foot, right? Is I think more or less what I'm trying to argue here. Other thoughts or questions on aspects of narrative design and designing games or designing scenarios? Yeah.
I guess another thing is like, be careful not to treat characters just like tools,
Yeah.
because there's a certain like balance to be had where like a character can actually be a character versus a character seeming like a toy. That's when like in GTA, for example, like a bunch of random civilians, someone will just hit him with a car and laugh at the ragdoll.
Yeah.
Whereas like, but there's also the extent where, what's the game? The Dragon Age games, they like kind of have gone back and forth on your companions and like certain romantic things that you can do because of like weird things in the fandom. And it's just gotten weird,
Yeah.
like, back and forth the things that they did. They like gave the characters themselves less agency,
Yeah.
but it resulted in really awkward and weird character interactions. But they thought it was a good thing that they're doing, so it allowed more freedom for the player.
Yeah.
Yet that actually was a bad thing in this situation.
Right. Well, it's one of those things too that working with, so I work at RIT, I work with a huge number of game design students. A lot of them get jobs in industry. And it's one of those things, if you are a super good storyteller, but a decent coder, you will never get a job. If you are super good at coding, but you are okay at telling stories, then you'll get a job before anybody who's super good. Like they really need you to be good at coding. But what ends up happening too, I think another thing that comes up a lot is the scope of the story that you're trying to tell. You've got this box, and a lot of times when I'm doing master's theses, they'll come to me in September to be one of the people as the narrative advisor, and they're trying to write Skyrim, right? And I'm like, you've got a year to make this game? You're not even going to be able to make one of the cities in Skyrim. You might be able to make one situation in one of the cities in Skyrim, right? So like, you got to down scope to like, maybe the narrative is not going to be that important for this one vertical slice of a game you want to show off at GDC. So it's the same, it's something else too, thinking about how much can you fit in, because I'll tell my students, like, I need a story that is 3,000 words, and they'll turn in something that's 6,000 words. Like, you didn't follow these, and it's like, oh, the story was too big. I'm like, you didn't follow the assignment, right? You can tell a story in 3,000 words, but you probably shouldn't try and, spit a 10,000 word story into 3,000 words, because that's not gonna work. So it's sort of like the accordion, is that you need to be able to play with all of these things. And games are particularly hard, I think, especially when you're starting out, as to what's a reasonable scope. And then also what ends up happening is, and I'm sure Wendy, you probably run into this too, if you would have mentioned it, or have any stories about it, is that they have an idea and then they need to scope down and scope down and scope down. And all of a sudden, some of these things that were essential are now no longer in. So it breaks the whole narrative, right? So you're like, why does this game suck? Or why does this story in this game suck? It's because, they had to, in the 11th hour, remove this entire section that would have made sense of that. But now that's gone, right? And we don't ever get to see that part. Have you run into that with your?
Oh yeah, in fact, I had one of my last students at Fisher. I went back for the senior project presentation, and he had the website for the game and then the game itself. And the website of the game described a party-based JRPG, had tons of description of the world and the characters and everything. And then the game itself was a little sort of like puzzle adventure game with like
Right.
3 different levels. And I was like, oh, I see what happened here.
Yeah.
You were there and you realized that in one semester you were only getting here.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of conversations about how, because he is very interested in like turning this into a mobile game that he maybe iteratively releases levels for. And so we talked about like, how do you take this setting and these characters that you've developed and transition them out of this JRPG, which is not in the cards for, the 5-year forecast,
Yeah.
and make them work in this forecast. And I mean, one of the things, I think it's come up a couple times, and I was just thinking about, we only, at least, up until college and maybe even much later, experience the end point of the creation process when we see the final film, the final game, the completed manuscript. And it's very rare anymore that we get insight into everything that got left in the cutting room floor. And I wonder to what extent that impacts the way, like we talk about this a lot in freshman composition, breaking down a student's idea that good writers are people that like spew forth brilliance in their first draft, right? Like, no, things are messy. It's a hot mess until the last minute. But with stories as well, the fact that students don't see the stuff that got left behind. They don't know the people, places, things that you have in holding that you're not using. And that I'm just thinking aloud. In some ways, I think that that's like, I don't know, dungeon mastering is a nice sort of way to teach that, or improv, right? You have your bank of things that you may never use. It's not a loss if you don't use them. It's not a loss that my student came up with this whole intricate setting that doesn't make it into the game, right? But understanding that and being comfortable with, I came up with this, it doesn't make the final thing.
Yeah. How many of you are teaching game designers? Anybody? Yeah, we're gonna say.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to jump up the last couple of comments. One was about the idea of trying to make sure that characters don't just feel like they are utilities in the story or whatever. And there's a cliche that I think it's helpful that everybody is the hero of their own story. So I think that's always a helpful thing to keep in mind. But another thing that I think is helpful with that it's hard to do, and also kind of fights with scope a little bit, but I think it's really valuable, is in your world building, trying to define a cultural context that will actually affect the character's actions. It's something that I am very disappointed in when I play like Assassin's Creed games, is I get very excited about all of the sparkly graphics, and it's all right, ancient Egypt. And I find that like a lot of the quests in ancient Egypt could just as easily have been in Vikings. They could have been in Renaissance Italy. There's nothing about the culture that the characters that are living in that would make them respond differently to events that are happening. And I think like a positive example of this is like the first 5 or 10 minutes of Mad Max Fury Road. Like you learn so much about the way that the little Oasis culture operates, and like the war boys, like quasi-religious stuff, and a lot of that was done silently with just visuals. But I think trying to think about, because all throughout, the world in history, cultures think differently about, even though we have so many shared emotions and stimuli, we process them very differently. So how do the characters in your world possibly process something differently than if it was in a different setting?
Yeah.
There was an interview with one of the game directors for Assassin's Creed 3 when they announced that it was going to be a native main character, and he explicitly said like, but don't worry, he is an assassin, and that's the thing that's gonna inform like who he is. It's not this culture. Like, and I was like, bro, but why? Like, why go to all the trouble to do this if you're going to be like, but don't worry.
We consulted with many assassins.
He's still just an assassin. It's okay.
Yeah.
You're safe. But it's weird, right?
The job is like, go find my dog. That there might actually be a way that an ancient Egyptian would respond to that differently than a Viking, and I could make the story more interesting.
Well, I taught a class, I think it was in grad school, where we read one North American, Native American folk tale, part of a Viking saga and part of a Greek myth. And like none of the students at all understood. It was sort of stunning that these are all like non-Christian, not even like we've had Christianity, we're fighting against it. They're all pre-Christian, right? They don't even have the concept of Christianity in the way that we do. It's like, wow, you need to think about that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Like no one in previous centuries thought about things the way that a 21st century, and it's a lot to drop on a college student, but or a high school student, I suppose. And another questions, things that they do successfully when trying to, design narratives for interactive storytelling. The things you were hoping that this was going to be about.
We don't do things successfully.
Is that
We don't do things successfully.
right? Exactly.
guess one thing would be like, it's just kind of a offshoot of like, if this might never happen, but I guess if anyone ever here like is to work on a property that's already established, there's a weight that comes with that.
Yeah.
And that's something that you need to be careful about because, I mean, I feel like especially as of late, there's been a lot of like, oh, look, this is an adaptation, or oh, look, this is a continuation, and they completely miss or somewhat miss the mark. Like,
On the original,
yeah,
yeah.
like, I mean, personally, I just watched that Halo TV show recently, and it was one of the most miserable things I've ever
Really?
watched.
I've watched it here.
It was,
What made it so bad?
they put the name Halo on something that wasn't really at all Halo. It literally felt like they
Games don't have a history of doing that.
Yeah, it felt like they took a random sci-fi show that was like middle of the road, 5
Yeah.
out of 10, put Halo's name on it, put a bunch of Halo characters' name on I'm not really accurate characters, and they're like, it's Halo,
Yeah.
it's got a big budget, you're gonna like it.
Right, and it's a TV series, right?
Yeah, it's a TV series, had like, supposed to have 10 episodes, they shortened it to 9, it already got approved of season 2 before it even came out. And
Yeah.
it's not good.
That's what, I mean, one of the things too that I'm super interested in is this aspect of, like, if I really, what I've been focused on the last couple of years is narrative structure in episodic formats. You can have a 10 episode story that goes over a season, so like, the golden age of TV or whatever. It was really interesting. How many people watch Book of Boba Fett? Okay, if you haven't. The narrative structure is very strange. And I'm very convinced that they were writing it while they were filming it, because it's a very commercial, like the commercial considerations that hopefully you as teachers and, academics don't need to worry about. But that whole question of like how TV is being made, the speed at which it's being made, and how the writing happens are really media dependent in that case. And they're really same thing with movies. You start going over budget, they got to hack apart the script. But it's like what you were saying, Wendy, is it's more interesting to see why these failures happen rather than, necessarily if it works perfectly. Yeah.
Do you have an example with this Book of Boba Fett that made you think like, oh man, they're really just like writing this?
Yeah, so one of the things, you see it all over, but one of the things in fiction writing tends to be, you want to start at a moment and then move forward chronologically in that same direction and only slip into a backstory or a flashback when you were totally cemented in the present. And Boba Fett immediately starts slipping into backstory, right? It's like a little bit of the present, and it's because you don't trust. And the other thing that's really interesting is Breaking Bad does this all the time. I'm rewatching Breaking Bad. It starts with a clip that's near the climax because there's a little bit of a lack of conviction that the story is interesting enough that it'll get you there to just do the natural events, right? So they had to set it up with, oh my God, why is Walter White in the desert with a gun? And then we're going to go back and find out he's a teacher, right? And from a fiction writing perspective, that tends to be kind of a bait and switch, right? Like if it's a really compelling story, you could just start with him in the classroom and lead to that point. But there was somebody was just talking about this the other day, a TV show that they were rewatching, David and Sopranos. And he's like, oh, it's chronological. Like we don't do that anymore. And I think the reason why we don't do that anymore is because these shows are being written well, because that's a great way to then be able to go, by the time in episode 4, you know what it is you're supposed to be doing, right? Then you can start writing those scenes and cut back and say, oh, well, this is why they did that. And this explains this future thing. But you see it all the time. The Marvel shows, like if you watch all these new shows on Netflix that are coming out, kind of pay attention to how quickly they go into a flashback. And that tends to sort of be if you're looking at it from like an narrative design, specifically a fiction perspective, that tends to be a red flag. Like, I wonder why they needed to do that. And a lot of times it's because they're bandaging, a mistake that they made that they can't make up because they shot all that stuff, 10 weeks ago or something.
So I just watched the new Matrix movie on the plane, like less than 24 hours
I
ago.
haven't seen it yet.
And I gotta say, it's gotta be at least 15% flashback to old movies, right?
Oh,
So I was gonna ask how you interpret that, but I'll leave that for your future.
I think that Memento is like one of those movies in which that, like, everybody watched that and like, that's awesome. But it's like, okay, but not every movie needs to be Memento. It's going backwards in time. And it's not a hard and fast rule that anytime you get a flashback, but generally it's sort of like that book that's an artificial hook to get you to the next thing, where really, if you've got an interesting character in an interesting situation that you care about, you're willing to see where they go without having to have lots of artificial sort of things. Yeah.
I guess another thing is just be careful of timelines. If there's like more than one, you just need to be careful sometimes.
Yes.
Like the new Witcher, well, not new anymore, but the Witcher show.
Yeah,
first
yeah.
season, it had 3 separate timelines going on at once. They didn't really bother to tell you that.
Yeah.
And you need to figure it out on your own, or if you don't, you're just going to be confused. And that's why, like, 2 people I was watching with were like, I just don't get it.
I had no idea watching the first season of The Witcher that was happening
I
until the very
thought
end.
it was pretty quick, but I was also like, I don't mind this idea. Just wasn't executed super well.
Yeah.
But yeah, timelines can get finicky. Also, Marvel movies with
Yeah.
timelines and stuff,
Yeah.
a lot of their timeline stuff doesn't really make sense, but they kind of just hand wave it and we're like,
Yeah.
superhero movies doesn't make it make sense.
The thing too that I think is unique in this moment, maybe it's not unique, I don't know, maybe Roger and I would argue on this. At least it's somewhat unique, I'm thinking, in this moment in media history, is that we've got all of these massive worlds, right? We've got George R. R. Martin, we've got Tolkien, we've got the Star Wars, that's been 40 years old. We've got, the Marvel comics that go back 70 years or whatever. It's a huge reservoir that they're drawing from to do all this transmedia stuff. And if you are starting off as like an individual creator, you will not, unless you want to spend 50 years just generating stuff or finding 100 of your friends, you can't create a transmedia world. That's why they're trying to tap into these major properties that are so old. That's why they've been sort of hunkered over on Tolkien's grave for so long, because it's like once they start to open that up, it's more transmedia storytelling. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. But it's also, when I'm working with students, that issue of scope. You can tell a super compelling story about 2 people in a room that happens in an afternoon or happens in an hour, right? And just by knowing what you're doing with this stuff and tinkering with it. And students especially are so into the massive lore, like, Halo. There's how many different stories, like the Halo lore. And Tori was talking about Splatoon's got hundreds of pages of lore, right? And there seems to be with the kids that are growing up, and I've got a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old. Wait, no, they're 8. They're getting older. But yeah, it's like they're so into, like, one of them loves the SCP Foundation, and like that's got hundreds of thousands, and that's just what they're that's their normal, right? I mean, that's how stories were normally told. Whereas, you wouldn't normally just buy, when I was a kid, you buy a novel or whatever, and you read that novel, you'd have to wait a while for the next one to come out. Yeah, so I'm teaching a Star Wars class this semester, and that whole idea that those 3 movies came out over the period of almost a decade, right? And you couldn't rewatch them whenever you wanted, like, it's mind-blowing to the students and my kids in this day and age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's really important doing narrative for games because it's so iterative. You gotta be prepared, change lots of things in the response to potentially other collaborators, other aspects of the art that aren't working with the story, especially in response to playtesting. And to keep you from writing it over and over and over again in its entirety, I think you need to try to commit fairly early on to like what the pillars are and then what like the soft spaces in between the pillars are.
Yeah,
Like, so you say, like for better or for worse, the games that I worked on have been kind of walking simulator-y, and there are different ways that I could have gone with that. But like the thing that I always had locked in was like the environment layout is not going to change. And so they can take a different path through there, slightly different things can happen to them. But if the story isn't working, I'm not going to make a new room because of the time that takes. I'm going to say I need to find out a different thing to happen in this room, or that thing needs to happen in a different room, or what have you. And so it could be the environment, it could be the story, depending on the project, it could be the music, it could be any type of thing where you're like, this is staying. But you kind of need to define early like what your rocks are, and then, but at the same time, consciously say there are big chunks of this that can totally go if it's not working, so that you can respond to all the different impulses that you're going to be dealing with managing the project like that.
Yeah, I was gonna, as you were talking, this is something that I do all the time. This is why I'm super interested in this question of structure. If you just accept that this is a way that you could do storytelling, what ends up happening is the climax actually resolves what happens here. So these two are causally linked. And what you're saying there is you can add subplots in here. That's what a novel does. They add 5 or 6, 7 other subplots. But still, that main, is Frodo going to get to throw the ring away? Well, 10,000 pages later, yes, he does, right? A lot of shit happens in between there. But you can also cut a lot of that out and just get to the brass tacks of it, right? Write it almost as a short story if you wanted to. So that's where I will often have students say, I'm going to tell a story that's happening over 7 acts. And I say, well, why don't we make it 3, right? A beginning, a middle, and an end. And then if you want to, we can expand to 5. You know what I mean? But like these two will, as you're definitely saying, these two are the ones that can go. Like, don't even start thinking about these yet, right? Until we got the 3 sort of nailed down, because if it's only 4 or whatever, it's not that big of a deal. Whereas when you say I'm going to start with 7, and then they're like, okay, well, we got 1, and then they jump to like 4, right? And then it's like, okay, well, the project's due next week, and it's like, okay, so then it's like 6.5 is what we have, right? And you're like, this doesn't make any sense, but that's all we had time for. And it's like, but that doesn't make it good.
So you jump to like plot as the rock. One of the things that you were not talking about plot.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can
Yeah.
be anything you rock, but you have to lock some things in to give you enough certainty. So.
Yeah, I love that idea of like maybe tone is your rock and like I'm gonna hit
Yeah.
this tone. I'm
Yeah,
never
just
gonna.
like if theme is the most important thing to you, probably like the fate of the protagonist at the end is your rock, because what happens to them is going to
Yeah.
reinforce your theme. But like in horror, a lot of times atmosphere is your rock.
Yep.
You know, they're in this scary house, and whether they live it or not at the end of the movie is kind of immaterial.
Yeah.
And so you can just decide what you think is most important, lock that in, and then work around that as your constraint as things move.
Yeah, I feel like we keep going back to plot.
Yeah, it's probably me.
And like, to me, the other things in some ways are more interesting because I think it's, especially working with novice game designers, they just want to like hone in on that
Something, yeah.
plot, right? Like that. And I think it's classic. Like you said, like we're used to 3-act structure, whether we can define it or not. So that's what we're looking for. But like to push out from that, to say like, no, what if you chucked your plot and you made theme the thing that matters, or you made
Yeah.
setting the thing that matters? Like let go of that for 5 minutes
Yeah.
and play.
Well, that's the thing is, so many of my students want to have a narrative-driven game, and they don't know enough about narrative to pull it off,
Yeah.
right? Because they're
Yeah.
used to playing Skyrim and all that kind of stuff. But no, I agree completely. There are lots of great games that don't have
Which-
very little plot.
Skyrim is not your great model.
Right.
If you're wanting to make a good
A good
linear
narrative.
story game. Like that's
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
stories. The
What-
world is great. The story is kind of.
One of the things too that we haven't talked about at all is how game mechanics are interacting with all these things too, which is probably a pretty important thing to talk about with games. But yeah,
That's actually one of the things I was getting towards. I was thinking of the game, so it's just ironic because this game, like the gameplay is integrally linked to the plot and to the characters and everything. Hades, a pretty recent game where like it's a cyclical plot in a way, like it's kind of like 2 different plots at once. Whatever, but
Yeah.
like it's multiple playthroughs to actually fully complete quote unquote the plot.
Mm-hmm.
And the entire game is based on the premise that, like, you're dying, you're being sent back to the beginning. That's part of the plot, but that's also a game mechanic at the same time, and everything that you do in that game is pretty much linked. Like, it's just really, it's insanely well done. It's one of my favorite games in a long time, but everything is super tightly knit between gameplay, music, art, writing, everything. It's just really interesting how
Yeah.
it works.
Well, I think to that to the point that I think Wendy was just making too, that your game, this is for a game that has game narrative or narrative design as part of its core. Probably, I mean, there are lots of games that don't have it at its core. It's just a feature, right? That's not a bad thing, right? I mean, it's like if you want to have a game that's mostly about atmosphere. When I'm teaching this, it's mostly because I'm trying to teach them how to tell a story that is about 4,000 words long, that has a good structure that is based on a character facing interesting problems and solving those questions, right? So I use role-playing games, and every time they make a decision in the role-playing game, I say, mark that down. Why did your character make that decision? We're going to need to get inside their head to understand why did they do the thing they do, regardless of whether the role succeeds or the role doesn't succeed. But it's important for them to at least have some beginning, middle, and end, because that's what I'm teaching. Right? If that's not what you're teaching, then you may not need that at all. Like there's a lot of VR experiences that are really cool that there's no plot at all, right? You're just there to sort of like hang out under the water, or, in space or whatever it is. Other questions, comments, things that you've got And I think, that question of mechanics too is an interesting one in terms of what the theme is or what your learning outcomes might be for using games in classes. The other thing too that I think is interesting is asking students to do this, to take a project and have them design their own sort of game along these lines, because you really need to know your material well in order to do half of this, right? You know what I mean? And if they can articulate, if you're in a teaching situation where you're like, okay, well, it's Skyrim, but now you got to do it with Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn or whatever, right? Like, how would they start breaking apart all of the components and think about what would be the setting and the plot, and how would the different character arcs, how can those be seen as like side quests and things like that? You really have to have a mastery of how that book works or any of those books work in order to be able to sort of turn it into an RPG. I mean, it doesn't actually have to work. You just have to have the process, the thought process. Other thoughts, ideas? How long is this going for, right?
I think it's a 3:45.
So, okay.
If we're on our main thing open,
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
we can go early if we want, but
No, that's, yeah, so, I mean, hopefully this is interesting and for everyone. I mean, yeah, James?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's always good to just keep an eye on like every single formal aspect of your game and think if that can communicate narrative in an interesting way or not, So, I mean, there's games where, color filters change, that signal something about narrative, fonts can change, that can signal something about narrative, all kinds of things with sound, rumble, any of those sorts of things. And then I also just think that there are a lot of narrative possibilities that are totally specific to games that can be very revealing. And so just keep an eye out for examples that you like, and like two like very classic ones that just have to do with like conversation trees that I like are the famous example of Depression Quest, where it gives you choices, but you can't choose certain choices, and that's informing you about the helpless state that your character is experiencing. And then the other that I thought was just very profound is like in Kentucky Route Zero, there's sections of the game that are completely linear. And so no matter what you choose, it doesn't change the outcome of the game, but it still gives you choices. And so those not only allow you a little bit of agency in a totally linear game, but the fact that the choices are often very different than one another, it makes you think about the character. So it's almost like in that moment, you are getting like an internal monologue, and then you are interpreting that. And so even though it doesn't affect any of the actions of the game, it feels active because you see the very different things that somebody could say. Like an example is, I don't think this is exactly the game, but somebody would say like, how you feeling today? And like one option is like great, and another one's like so, and the other one's like, yesterday my mother died, or something like that. And so it's like a very extreme difference, but just seen is communicating stuff to the player.
Yeah, I think, I always like to hit on language too, and like the specific words that you use that convey a certain tone or whatever. One of the games that I thought that I'm a huge fan of the first half of it is Firewatch. Anyone play Firewatch? It starts off with a really short interactive fiction that allows you to make a few simple choices that kind of cast, and it doesn't have any mechanical effect on the story, but it kind of puts you in a different frame of mind of where your character is in that moment. And that's a game in which too, I think, it was, for me, I really liked the first half where it's just sort of like you're walking and you're thinking and whatever. And then it gets a little bit too like plot heavy towards the second half, right? Where it's like something has happened and now you need to figure it out. I'm like, I just kind of like walking in a national park with pastel colors. Like that was cool enough.
Well, and I happen to know from the development of that game that their pillar was not the ending.
Yeah.
Because they're like, we're in a national park, we know a couple of creepy things will happen, but they didn't have any idea how that fits together, which I think is why they ended up being one of the weaker parts of it.
Yeah. That's like LA Noire too, where they have to insert all of the Grand Theft Auto stuff into it because they're afraid they don't have the courage of their convictions that, picking up items and looking at them was interesting enough. So, yeah. What's that?
No. I think it's interesting. So you mentioned like the false choices there, and you were talking about false fix here, and it seems like there's something to what your audience will tolerate, right? And like, you were mentioning Witcher, and I was thinking about Game of Thrones. Maybe the first 2 or 3 books that I read, the switching perspective was kind of interesting. I was like, oh, I get to see what's going on all over this world. I'm getting all these different perspectives. I'm not locked into
Yeah.
any one character. And then it got to the point where I started to feel that it was a false hook. Like I felt that cliffhanger, and I knew that it was going to be hundreds of pages before I came back to that character, right? And so like, but yeah, I mean, I became aware of it. I became conscious of it.
Yeah.
But it worked for a while, right? Like it worked for a while, and I feel like those false choices, those will work for a while. But I remember playing the Telltale Walking Dead,
Yeah.
and getting pissed off pretty quickly when I realized the sheer number of choices that didn't matter, right?
It's
So
really,
like,
that's, I was gonna say that's Telltale's big thing.
yeah, but like but saying that your choices do matter,
Yeah, yeah.
having them not matter, than saying that they do. That's their thing.
I was gonna say, keep coming back to the plot and structure thing, because it's my current love affair. But the story with George, if you don't know, the story with George R.R. Martin is that was the Song of Ice and Fire is supposed to be a trilogy.
Yeah.
And it was too long, and they said, we wanted a fourth book. And it was selling well, so they said 7 books for 7 kingdoms. And he said, I don't have 7 books in me, I have 4 books in me. You know, like, George, here's a contract, look at the money. So then he signs it off. He'd already written the first 2, and in the book 3 is where you get this very artificial, it's like, it's all coming to an end, and then it's like all this other weird stuff artificially opens out. And that's why, you know, it's like you can't suddenly be like, oh, we're gonna change it to here and just keep doing it, right? Because it's like, that's what threw off the entire thing. And then the thing that's super fascinating is how they're adapting it in the HBO show ahead of the material. Like, that was just such a huge disaster. So that's Transmedia Story World is an adaptation, and the Transmedia Extensions is like the narrative side that I do on the sort of media studies lit side.
There is a level of those false hooks that can be like it.
Right.
It can work, right? Like to an extent, those false choices create a sense of character for you, right? And it's like,
Somewhere in there it matters.
it's figuring out that tipping point between like, now you've gone too far, now I see the artifice of what you're doing to me, right? And riding that line between using some of those to keep people engaged and also to streamline what you are doing.
Yeah.
Versus tipping over into book 6 of Game of Thrones.
Now I imagine in terms of narrative, that's kind of like the novelty of it, like something can be new and like, oh, that's exciting because that's new. But then like if they use that trick over and over and over again, like, oh, in your novel, like this person isn't really dead, he's still alive. Oh, this person's not really dead too, they're still alive. Like, and then it's just like, well, death is death and cheap then. Like if you can do it once, it's like, oh my God, he's still alive, that's so amazing. But like after the 5th time you do it, then there's that.
Well, and like Silent Hill 2, this is going way back. I also love horror games. Silent Hill 2 was real vague on how you got different endings, to the point where like you started to get paranoid about like, if I look at this for too long, will this impact my ending? Like what will, and you don't fully know the system. So it's like, in some ways it's more fun than a Fallout karma, like good thing, right? Like there's a level of excitement and exploration and novelty to it because you're not fully aware of how the system works, but like, you know, then you look at a fact and you're like, okay, well, don't talk to this person more than twice and don't do this, and then that shine is gone and it's less
I'm really
exciting.
Really interested in like nowadays with the internet. There's also like, you know, you can look up the quickest way to do something. If you're in like a talking simulator, it's like, oh, I gotta reply with this way and this way to get the best ending. And so I like comparing like nowadays to like back in the day when like there were gaming bits. Like, oh my gosh, there's like a secret message here. Like people would like spread these, and I think that just like trying to find a way to like make a game super obscure or random or so to make it hard for someone like to, you know, pick apart would make for some interesting.
Yeah. And you have to wait for Nintendo Power to come in the mail to figure out.
I was gonna say, like, on the obscure note, Elden Ring just came out. That's their whole MO, is to be as obscure as possible, and it, like, I don't think even a quarter of the people that play the game would finish half of the quests if they couldn't look them up online.
Yeah.
It's it's one of those things that blows my mind, because they're right, like their lore and like a lot of the stuff that they do is so good and like rich and stuff, but at the same time, feel if it was any other company doing like the kind of writing that they are, they would get absolute hell for it because of how vague
Yeah.
and quote unquote pointless and so on it all seems to be. It's
Yeah.
such a weird game exclusive weird like thing.
Well, I think that's one of the tough things, like choices matter in games too, because the intention is like, we're gonna let you play this the way that you want, so you can embody the character fully and you can have agency and whatever. But for me, anytime I play one of those games, it kind of invariably becomes like a meta discussion where I'm thinking like, what do I think the creators of this game
Yeah.
think the best ending is? And then I am now going to try to play in a way that conforms to that, so that I experience the best or most authentic or most
Yeah.
rewarding story. And so that's why like I'm a little skeptical of like the usefulness of some of those like branching narrative things, unless they are like some of the things that are just like totally generative. And there's been some examples of that this year, but yeah, and then it's like then it is more like D&D or something where the results are fairly random and you are providing meaning to those out of a limited set of possibilities.
Meanwhile, half of the people that play Dark Souls or the Elden Ring won't be able to tell you what any of the endings mean.
Yeah.
But they look kind of different. And
Yeah.
this one has fire and that one has no fire.
Right. That's good. And that's why I think,
When it's been an option, big no fire.
I was gonna say, I think in classrooms too, that's why I like using tabletop games, because you can just house rule it on the fly. You don't like a dice roll, we'll just pretend we didn't see it, it's much harder to do that with a digital game.
I was gonna say that Witcher 3 has an interesting, I think, balance between complete obscurity in the decisions that you make, and then your decisions don't matter, right? Where you go in and it's an obscure decision, you don't know you're making a game-ending, changing decision, but at the end of that sort of section, it has a moment in time where it flashes back to the decision that you made and said, okay, because you made this decision, this is what happened. So like you get the satisfaction of knowing that it was the choice that I made that caused this ending, and you know specifically, that it was that choice that you made that caused it. But when you first make the choice, you don't know that you're making a game ending.
Yes.
I think it's a nice balance.
I love this. I feel like that's sort of a brave choice too on a designer's part to like let that happen, to let a game ending choice happen. The first Elder Scrolls game I played was Morrowind, which I still like deeply love. And that game taught me like you're standing in front of a door, you save. You open the door, you save. You're gonna attack somebody, you save. After you attack them, you save. And I feel like they've lost that in the later games, right? And they, like, oh, you just get you knocked the character unconscious, right? And like it's a missed gut punch to get like I remember when that message would pop up on your screen, like you have doomed this world, revert to saved or persist in the world you created. But like that's a bold move. And once you know, like if I F up, I could ruin this whole story, right? Like I don't know, it changes the way that you approach the story versus like, oh, no, Starling unconscious. Well, guess that's that for now.
I think there's a difference between like, having something being a commercial success where it's just like, we're talking about niche cases of like, people would love to like lose really hard in a game. Whereas like the majority of the population, like if they lose really hard in a game, they might just not play it anymore. And like, I'm sure there's games like that for you where it's just like, oh, I'm not going to play this game if this happens. And so like, if it becomes like I don't know, if it becomes bigger and bigger, and like I think we were talking about Elden Ring, if people wouldn't do quests if they didn't have a guide for it, it's just like you have to fight that obscurity or like that difficulty into like, oh, how can I make it more appealing for like even more casual people that would just play it on the weekend without.
I'm an academic. I'm used to losing.
It's all continuous.
And scene.
It's supposed to be like a weird thing where like having too much agency is actually immersion breaking, which is intended to be the opposite. Like the point if you go and you kill every single person in Whiterun in Skyrim or whatever, but all of a sudden it's like this doesn't feel like I'm in a game anymore. This doesn't feel like in a real life situation. And so, but I've seen kind of clever like pushbacks against that. Like I think in Red Dead Redemption 2, which I still like, constantly accidentally kill people on that because they made a button for wave the same to shoot. Depending on your proximity to the players. So I'm constantly like, like howdy partner and just like shooting them in the head off their horse. But with the like persistent narrative characters, like you point the gun at them and like, I think you definitely can't fire it. I think the reticle even just disappears, like when it's hovering it on them. And so that is like tacitly communicating like your character would not shoot them because that's it's convenient for the story, but also that's just not a realistic thing that would happen in the world that you're inhabiting. So there's like a balance between sometimes agency makes you feel more immersed and sometimes too much of it can make you feel.
But that's again kind of back to like what kind of story is it,
Yeah.
right? Because Red Dead, like you are a character and you need to embody that character. But Morrowind, like you're just some idiot that came off a ship, right? Like you're anybody. You don't even get a name. And so I think that it works, and I think that it would work in Skyrim too if they like had the guts to bring that mechanic back, because you're not necessarily meant to be anybody in particular. You could be the dude that goes and just massacres Whiterun. That's part of the point. Like their linear story is not amazing. It's the world building and the emergent story. So it's different ways to approach the story and then to interpret game mechanics based on your approach to that story. I just want to kill more people and stuff.
Yeah, that's, you're saying that too, that brings me back to the question about whether it needs structure, because one of the more fun games that I played recently was Darkest Dungeon. I didn't get far at all because I suck at it, but I loved it. It's like the aesthetics are so cool and the voiceover is so cool. I can't think of a movie that I watched the first 30 minutes, never watched the rest of it. Was like, that was awesome. or a book where you read 3 chapters and you're like, that was it. Like you want the whole thing, whereas there are plenty of games in which you can play just a fraction. And you're like, that was enough. What's that?
Wally.
Well, have you talked about Fallout at all?
A little, yeah.
I mean,
Of
just kind of like right now, just regarding Skyrim versus Morrowind versus other Bethesda style games, like Trent and I wrote a paper once, a proposal once about Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, focused on the relationship between parent and child and how those are central to the narrative. But one of the things that's problematic is that for myself playing those games, I never did the main story. Like I didn't care about any of that. So it creates all these other problems when you define your own narrative in the context of the constraints that are placed on you by the designer. And I actually was just talking about this in the other room, that designers often, I think, will make the mistake of assuming that players will have a particular kind of experience instead of assuming that players will have emergent goals based on their own experience sets. So when I play a game like GoldenEye, I used to play with my friends in split screen, and we would divide up the map, and you'd have your own room, which was your house. And some people were allowed in, some people weren't. If you broke into somebody's house, you got the authority to kill them, and like that dynamic changed the way that you would play the game fundamentally. And it really does create its own narrative about. I mean, I can still remember I used to play the capitalist pig in Duke Nukem 64 or whatever, and like, we had our own stories that we ended up creating for these characters based on the way that we thought the game should be played. And not all of that can be designed intentionally. And often it's just the result of the constraints being developed in such a way that affordance is there for a particular player to be able to find and exploit for their own needs. So I also just, Skyrim, I was the person who kind of murdered everybody in Whiterun. And it was usually when I finished doing all of the quests in a given area, and I'm like, okay, well, sorry everybody, your time's up. Megaton or whatever.
Yeah.
It's always been step 1 was blow up Megaton.
Yeah.
Step 1, blow up Megaton. Step 2, profit. Yeah, but I brought that up a little bit earlier because I was mentioning my husband and I playing Dead Space 2, and like we have this whole narrative about Isaac. I looked it up, it's Isaac.
Oh.
Isaac, and I remember Nicole, because that bitch Nicole, she just would not leave us alone. But we had this whole like narrative about Isaac, whose ex-girlfriend would not leave him alone, and kept calling. Eventually, to like drill through your eye because she's a bitch. But yeah, I feel like in some ways, to me, those are sort of more interesting than reaction.
Right.
Right, because it's what does your player make of it? What do they take of it? And then thinking about how I don't know, I hate the phrase serious games, but I feel like a lot of the games that I do would be considered serious games. So like, I'm making Grad Life the RPG. I want you to have that emergent narrative. I want you to have a fun time with it, but I don't want you to take the wrong thing from it, or right, like the Oneida stuff that I'm doing. Same thing. Certainly, I want people to be able to see themselves in it, to think about it, to be creative with it. But there is a wrong way to read that, and so thinking about creating space for a multitude of readings, but not opening the door to wrong reading.
Yeah, that's
I
like
guess.
the VR thing this morning, when I can't remember the historian who was saying you don't want, you don't want the historical trial to come out the wrong way, right? Like we're gonna exonerate Nazis in my high school history class, right? Maybe it's not the
That'd be
learning
a great
outcome you're
news
looking
story.
for. Yeah.
It looked like one of the games we're talking about tomorrow, EOS 503, the one Coulter is a grad student who's developing that for his dissertation, and it's very similar. It's a narrative-driven experience, and one of the reasons why I was really interested in doing this is because I had worked on projects previously where there was the illusion of choice in the same way that Telltale games have it, except it was even more limited because it was designed thinking in terms of wanting teachers to have these pro-social outcomes. So you'd have 4 choices, but all 4 choices were pretty much identical. It was like, I said something really nice, or I said something kind of nice. And you don't really, the emotional valencing of that is what ends up dictating your choice, but it doesn't matter. And so when we were developing EOS, we basically went in with this idea that we want choices to matter and have different outcomes, but the emotional balancing has to be equivalent across all of them. So you can make bad choices that intentionally anger or upset certain kinds of people in the world, but they're not getting angry or upset, and you don't, because of the fact that, rather, let me rephrase that. We designed it intentionally so that there were positive outcomes and negative outcomes. You could not just always succeed, but that the negative outcomes were dictated by some other trajectory that you place that character on going forward. So it's not as though you're going into Whiterun and murdering Nazim just because you feel like it. It's instead, you gave bad advice that this person then took, and then it caused them to have a negative outcome. And so that creates a new kind of relationship between you as the player and the NPC you're acting on. It's hard though. It's really, really hard. And I don't know, I mean, if I were making Fallout or Skyrim, I don't know if I could do it.
I think too, like one of the things that when looking at those games, and for so many games, it's to go from being the nobody to the savior of the world. And it's really hard for me to teach fiction writing students that often tragedies or getting partially what you want or not getting what you want and actually being happy about it. Like those are all very valid and interesting stories that exist instead of games just being leveling up and getting to your final conclusion. Or rarely, I mean, there's very rarely a time in which you read something like a classic work of literature where that's the story and you're like, yeah, that's awesome. It usually does not work like that.
Everyone was happy and it all worked out.
Yeah.
Famously happy Hamlet.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, John Kirby talks a lot about that, the need to have the main character or protagonist of the story focus on some tragic event that they are responsible for. So like I think he called it the ghost, this idea that there is something that haunts the main character and that they feel like they have ownership of that caused pain or suffering for other people, and that getting from being a nobody to being the hero is really about resolving that internal conflict, like Avatar: The Last Airbender is in that category. And Aang feels responsible for the war and the 100 years of suffering that followed it. And it takes the entire narrative for him to be able to come to terms with what happened.
Yeah. That's, as you were talking, so one of the things I got a lot of mileage out this past couple of years teaching fiction writing is having this map at the end, and it's sort of like you can put your character wherever you want. But after the end, after this is resolved in the climax, are they happy with what they got what they wanted, they're happy about it? So it's like yes, or yes, they got what they wanted, but they're not happy about it, or they're not happy even though they got what they wanted, or they didn't get what they wanted and they're not happy about it, right? So there are those 4 quadrants that you can land in, and you can think about something like Breaking Bad. Where do you put Walter White at the end of that? How happy is he? How satisfied is he, right? But then you could look at things like Lord of the Rings, where Frodo, it's like, oh, he saved the world, but it's not for him. And there's lots of interesting ways in which your character could come up with a conclusion where they do the right thing, but maybe they're not happy about it, or what they think the right thing is changes dramatically. And that's something where I'm hoping, whenever we get to the next evolution of game storytelling, that we can get more nuanced endings, right? That they just kill everything in Whiterun and then you're like the hero. Or you're the hero, you leveled up enough that you can kill everyone in Whiterun, so that's what you have to go do. Just for movies or something.
Well, I
That's
think,
where I've gotten to an XCOM.
I think the challenge with what you were saying, Stephen, is like not ending up with women in refrigerators, right?
Yeah.
Because that's more, actually, more frequently than it should be, that's the motivation, right? And like, I'd be very wary of perpetually conveying that other people's suffering is fodder for your own growth. Because I think that that is culturally a problem, right? And that's kind of the, like the God of War, right?
Yeah.
Type of thing. Or I was, as you were talking, I was thinking about Prey, the 2006 Prey, where like partway through your wannabe girlfriend gets grafted onto an alien and then you have to kill her because they're like grafted on together. But you know, you go on and you like, that's a trauma that you work through and then you're fine. She's dead and mangled, but you're good because you're the hero and you succeeded.
You don't get to like marry the grafted girl kind of alien.
No. She's like alien on the bottom, girlfriend on top, and she's like talking to you in the it's a, I don't know who designed it's
Missed opportunity.
there were many missed
One
opportunities.
is marriage, the other is murder.
Exactly. Six sides of the, you know.
Like all male-female relations. There you go.
Can I just get coffee with the half of them? That would be a big deal.
Maybe it doesn't work out, and that's okay.
That's what disco will lead you to. Well, I'll just say that we're approaching time to go have drinks and hors d'oeuvres and such, so you can continue the conversation if you want, or you can carry it over to Wilbur Cross and go in there. All of these sessions have gone really well. They're just popping them out.